The house, over 100 years old, was reduced to rubble under the crushing weight of the HOA's bulldozer. They labeled it a community architectural violation, but to me, it was home, the place I was born, where 3 generations of my family had lived, and the final gift my mother ever gave me. There was no warning, no chance for repair, just a notice of violation. And 17 minutes later, everything was gone. What they didn't realize, though, was that their entire 2,000 cattle ranch relied on the water lines that ran beneath my land. I didn't fight. I didn't hire a lawyer. I simply turned a valve. And right now, I'm holding something that, within 8 hours, will bring that woman, the HOA president, to her knees, pleading for forgiveness, tears in her eyes. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, because this is just the beginning. I was in what used to be my mother's sewing room, carefully placing her hand-stitched handkerchiefs into a memory box, when the ground began to tremble. At first, I assumed it was the highway construction 2 miles out, but the shaking grew more focused, more rhythmic, like mechanical thunder getting closer. I set down the final handkerchief, the one she finished just before cancer took her 3 months ago, and walked to the window. What I saw stopped me cold. A massive yellow bulldozer had parked itself right at the edge of my property, its diesel engine rumbling like some ancient predator waiting to pounce. Behind it stood a lineup of individuals. Victoria Blackwood, the HOA president, flanked by 3 board members, 2 county inspectors, and a police officer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Victoria held a clipboard in one hand and what looked like a formal document in the other. Her polished red nails glinted in the morning light as she pointed toward my house with the confidence of someone who had never once been denied. Still holding my mother's handkerchief, I stepped outside and walked to the fence line where this self-appointed tribunal had gathered. "What's going on here?" I called, even though a heavy knot in my gut warned me I wasn't going to like the answer. Victoria gave me a smile, the kind you'd expect from a shark before it tears you apart. "Mr. Thornfield," she said loudly, as though addressing an audience, "your home has been deemed an immediate threat to the safety of the community." She motioned toward my house, the one filled with the memories of my parents and grandparents, with a dismissiveness that made my blood boil. "It violates several architectural codes and poses imminent risk to surrounding properties." I stared at her, struggling to process the words. This was the same house that had stood firm through the Dust Bowl, 2 tornadoes, and countless storms. The place where my grandfather raised my father, where my father brought my mother home as his bride, where I took my first steps and spoke my first words. "What kind of threat are we talking about?" I managed to ask, keeping my voice steady. Victoria glanced at her clipboard with exaggerated flair. "According to our emergency assessment, the foundation is unstable, the roof could collapse at any moment, and the structure itself poses a serious danger to the public." She handed me a document. It looked official enough, engineering stamps, technical diagrams, all the trappings of legitimacy. But something felt off. The whole logo at the top was in Arial font, not the Times New Roman they usually used. The watermark looked wrong, but most disturbing was the photo labeled structural damage evidence. I'd seen that image before, not of my home but of a crumbling building in the next town I'd driven past on a work trip. It was lifted straight from Google Street View. "This report is a forgery," I said quietly, looking up from the page. Victoria's sharp smile didn't falter. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Thornfield, but emotions can't get in the way of public safety." The HOA board voted unanimously, county officials signed off, and we have full legal authority to proceed. Behind her, I noticed old Pete Thompson from a few houses down settling into a rocking chair on his porch, like he was about to watch some tragic live drama unfold. "You can't just demolish someone's home," I said, watching the bulldozer operator climb into his cab. "There are legal processes, requirements for notice, avenues to appeal." Victoria's expression shifted just slightly. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret, but then, like a mask snapping back into place, her cool professionalism returned. "All procedures have been followed." "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Thornfield, but sometimes, difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good." The engine growled to life, and something in me hardened. Months of grief and helplessness coalesced into something sharper, something focused. I looked down at the delicate cloth in my hands, at the one with tiny blue flowers that Mom stitched while telling me stories about her mother's garden. Her hands still strong enough to create something beautiful despite the pain. She always said, "Sometimes you have to lose what you love to discover how strong you really are." Turns out she was right. The bulldozer moved forward, and I watched 17 minutes of raw destruction erase a century's worth of family legacy. Beams that had survived nature's fury for decades snapped like twigs. The kitchen where my grandmother taught me her apple pie recipe was reduced to splinters. The porch where we'd watched countless sunsets disappeared beneath the debris. Victoria watched it all with the emotional detachment of someone auditing a spreadsheet. When the dust settled, she turned and left without a word. The others followed. The bulldozer operator started loading his machine onto the trailer, and I stood there, alone, in what was now just a scarred patch of earth filled with twisted metal and shattered memories. And for the first time all day, I smiled, because Victoria Blackwood didn't know the truth. Beneath the wreckage lay something the Thornfield family had protected for generations. She'd just made the worst mistake of her life. That evening, I sat by my mother's grave, talking to her like I had every night since the funeral. "They think they won, Mom," I whispered to her simple granite headstone. "But you always said the most important Thornfield secrets live underground." The cemetery was still. The only sound was the faint hum of traffic in the distance. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice again. "Use your mind, son, not your anger. That's how you honor what we built." I walked back to my pickup truck, but I didn't drive back to the motel where I'd been staying since the demolition. I had another destination in mind, one that would change everything. The lot was barren now, where a century of history once stood. Only disturbed earth remained, a scar across the land. The county had cleared the debris efficiently, erasing the physical remnants of my family's legacy. But they missed something that had been here before the house was even built. Behind a dense cluster of ancient oak trees, miraculously untouched, I found it. The rusted iron door to the old root cellar, dug by my great-grandfather in 1924. The hinges groaned like old bones as I pried it open. A gust of musty air, thick with time, escaped into the night. I clicked on my flashlight and descended the creaking wooden steps, each one murmuring secrets in the dark. At the bottom, I found myself in a stone chamber, no bigger than a modest bedroom. Hand-carved walls and shelves lined with broken jars and tools, ghosts of another era. But I wasn't here for the past, I was here for the future. In the far corner, tucked beneath a moth-eaten tarp, lay the thing I'd hoped was still there, an oilcloth-wrapped leather portfolio, my great-grandfather's most guarded possession. Inside were the original blueprints for the regional water system, every pipeline, valve, and control point painstakingly drafted in fading ink. The drawings told a story, a network of veins pumping life through the entire region. And right at the heart of it, under what used to be our house, ran the main artery. It connected to dozens of parcels, including one marked in bold, Blackwood Ranch 2,000 head capacity. Then I saw Ida tucked behind the blueprints, folded neatly as if it had been waiting for me. A legal document, dated March 15, 1924, deed of perpetual water rights, granted to the heirs of the Thornfield line. The language was dense and old-fashioned, but the meaning was undeniable. My great-grandfather hadn't just built the system, he'd retained sole control over it. Every home, every field, every faucet in a 5-mile radius pulled its water from beneath my feet. Legally, I photographed every page, every signature, every seal. Then I turned east, where the blueprints indicated a secondary chamber should be. I followed the stone wall, brushing aside cobwebs, until my hand landed on another iron door. Inside was a cramped space barely wide enough for one person. And there it stood, a massive brass valve wheel, oxidized to a deep green, but intact, ancient and powerful. A pressure gauge ticked steadily beside it. I could hear the distant roar of water rushing past, thousands of gallons every minute, all of it mine to control. My hand hovered over the wheel. One turn, one quiet twist, and Victoria Blackwood's kingdom would dry up like the dust beneath my boots. But I didn't touch it. Not yet. Mom always said, Use your mind before your anger. That's how you win. I climbed back out and called the only person I trusted with these, Marcus Rivera, the town's property rights lawyer and one of the few who showed up at Mom's funeral unprompted. He picked up on the third ring, kids shouting in the background. Ezra, everything okay? I found something, I said. Old documents. Water rights from the 20s. I need to know if they're still enforceable. There was a pause. Then, quieter. Thornfield water rights? Exactly. Can you keep it quiet? I'll need 48 hours. But if they're legit or broken bar, he trailed off. You might own more than just the land, Ezra. You might own everything it supports. As I hung up, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. One sentence. Mr. Thornfield, we understand you're grieving, but spreading lies about the HOA board won't help anyone. Perhaps it's time to seek professional help. A.V. Blackwood. I laughed, a bitter, low chuckle. She was already worried enough to start the smear campaign. I drove back to the cemetery. Looks like you were right, Mom, I whispered at her grave. I didn't know my strength to broken bar until everything was taken. I paused, eyes on the horizon, but now I do. And Victoria Blackwood is about to find out what happens when you tear down a Thornfield home. Pete Thompson called to ask if he could bring his famous cornbread, though he warned it might come out a little crispy. He still hadn't figured out the quirks of his oven. Mrs. Chen from the hardware store offered to loan me folding tables and chairs. Even Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist who'd recently moved to town to cover local politics, reached out. She asked if she could attend and maybe write a piece on how communities come together in times of loss. By Saturday, the weather was perfect. My plan wasn't to, but it didn't need to be. By noon, nearly 40 people had gathered on the lot where my house once stood, transforming the intended symbol of Victoria's dominance into something that looked and felt more like an old-fashioned church potluck. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were standing on top of a water system my great-grandfather built, the one that still kept half the town alive. Pete's cornbread lived up to its warning. It was practically a lump of charcoal, which got the first real laugh I'd heard in months. Marcus showed up with a box of legal documents, only to have a gust of wind knock them out of his hands. Papers scattered like leaves. Neighbors helped collect them, and I saw more than a few brows furrow as they read words like water rights and Thornfield Authority. I told stories about Mama, how she taught me that community meant more than conflict, and that helping our neighbors was always the first rule in our house. Then, casually, I brought up the water system. I explained how my great-grandfather had designed and hand-built it during the 1920s, and how it still quietly powered most of the area. Water is life, I said, gesturing to the earth beneath us. And controlling something that vital isn't about power, it's about responsibility. That's when she arrived. Victoria Blackwood appeared at the edge of the gathering like a storm front in high heels, flanked by two HOA board members who looked like they regretted signing up for the shift. Her eyes scanned the crowd, calculating. She was trying to decide if she had enough support to bulldoze through this moment. She chose confrontation. Mr. Thornfield, she called out, her voice slicing through the conversations like a blade. While I sympathize with your grief, using your mother's memorial to spread misinformation about property rights is both inappropriate and potentially illegal. The gathering fell quiet. This was the moment. I looked around at the faces of some I'd known since childhood, others I hadn't seen in years. They had watched my life unfold on this land. They had grieved with me. They loved my mother. I looked back at Victoria, all sharp edges and cold control. I smiled. Mrs. Blackwood, I said gently, would you like some of Pete's cornbread? It's a little crispy, but it was made with love. The crowd chuckled. It was small, but real. Mom always said love was the secret ingredient in anything worth sharing. There I was, offering food, grace, and memory. And there she stood, weaponizing a funeral for legal posturing. The energy shifted. People felt it. Victoria did, too. Her jaw tightened. She spun on her heel without another word. As she walked off, I heard Mrs. Chen whisper to her daughter, that young man's got more class in his little finger than some people got in their whole body. After most of the guests had gone, Marcus approached me. His expression was serious. Ezra, he said, you need to know Victoria just retained Blackstone Public Relations. I frowned. Crisis management. Worse, they specialize in character assassination. You need to be ready. It's going to get ugly. I watched as the last folding chair was packed into Mrs. Chen's truck. Marcus, I said, sometimes you have to get a little dirty to plant something worth growing. Mom taught me that too. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I made my way to the valve chamber again. I placed my hand on the old wheel but didn't turn it. Not yet. For the first time since the bulldozers came, I felt like I controlled the timeline. Victoria was about to learn that knocking down a house was just the beginning of a much more complicated story. Monday morning changed everything. The first sign came by courier, an envelope delivered by a man who looked like he'd rather be serving divorce papers to a professional wrestler. Inside, a thick, formal cease and desist letter from Victoria's new city lawyer. 3 pages of dense legalese that boiled down to a single message: stop talking about water rights or we will crush you in court. The charges were absurd. I was supposedly guilty of intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, and, in my personal favorite, a conspiracy to incite public disorder. I was still processing the document when Marcus called. "Ezra," he said, his voice buzzing with the restrained glee only a lawyer gets when their opponent screws up. "You might want to sit down." I did. I dug into Victoria's public financial records. She used $2.3 million from the HOA emergency fund to purchase her ranch. I blinked. "That's a broken bar not allowed, is it?" "That's embezzlement," Marcus replied. "In Texas, misusing over $300,000 in community association funds is a felony. She could be looking at 5 to 10 years. He wasn't done. "She's been buying other parcels too. 3 more, all adjacent to her ranch, bought in the last 18 months. She's been building an broken bar using other people's money." I sat in my truck, parked in front of the empty lot, the last of the folding chairs gone and the cornbread crumbs long blown away. Mom's words echoed back. Sometimes you have to be strong to protect what's sacred. The time for gathering information was over. It was time to act. I drove straight to the valve chamber, crawled down into the narrow space and laid my hands on the brass wheel. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was about defending my family's rights and exposing a level of corruption that had nothing to do with fences or zoning codes. The valve resisted, stiff with nearly a century's worth of mineral buildup and unyielding, just like the woman it was about to affect. I applied slow, steady pressure until it groaned, the sound echoing through the chamber like a warning. I turned it 1/4 rotation, just enough to drop the water pressure, not enough to cut it off. This was a message, not an act of war. The results came faster than expected. Within 2 hours, my phone started ringing. First it was the county water authority, asking if I'd noticed any pressure fluctuations. I told them the truth. I was performing routine maintenance on my family's private water infrastructure, legal, documented, and verified by Marcus. The second call was Victoria. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Ezra?" she snapped. Her voice, usually icy and composed, cracked like spring ice underfoot. "Maintaining my family's water system," I replied, calm as a judge. "If you're experiencing issues on your end, I'd recommend checking your infrastructure. Old systems need attention sometimes." There was silence, long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke again, her tone had shifted, a cool calculation replacing the earlier furry. "How much?" she asked. "How much what?" "For the land." "Name your price." And just like that, the puzzle snapped into focus. This wasn't just about the HOA or community standards. Victoria needed my land, desperately. That valve via the infrastructure beneath my Lota was worth something. Maybe everything. "My land isn't for sale," I said. "At any price." Another pause. Then, more carefully, "That property is strategically important for future development. I'll offer $2.5 million. That's 5 times the assessed value." Too much. Far too much for a $500,000 parcel. Unless she wasn't buying dirt, she was buying control. Control of water, of access, of silence. "I'll think about it," I said, lying through my teeth. After the call, I headed straight to the regional newspaper. Sarah Chen met me in her office, that investigative fire already burning in her eyes. "Hypothetically," I began, "if someone were using HOA funds to build a real estate empire, how would one prove it?" Her eyes lit up. "Hypothetically?" That would be one hell of a story. What do you have? We spent the next hour going over Marcus's findings of embezzlement, suspicious land purchases, the demolished house, and the water rights. Sarah took furious notes, asking sharp, pointed questions that made it clear she saw the bigger picture. If this holds up, she said, tapping her pen against her notebook, it's not just local corruption. This could blow wide open. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt since Mom's funeral. Hope. Victoria thought she controlled the board, but she didn't know the rules were about to change. Tomorrow, I'd turn that valve just a little more, and Sarah would start making calls that would turn Victoria's world inside out. Sarah called me at 6:47 a.m. on Wednesday, her voice crackling with the barely contained thrill of a journalist standing at the edge of a major expose. Copyright. Meet me at the diner in 20 minutes, she said, and bring a strong stomach. What I found changes everything we thought we knew about Victoria Blackwood. I'd been awake already, sitting on the edge of my motel bed, turning the valve key over in my hands. I didn't know it yet, but Sarah had just bought me more than time she'd bought me truth. When I walked into the diner, she was already in the back booth, surrounded by manila folders, printed photos, and satellite images laid out like evidence at a federal indictment. Her laptop glowed with aerial surveillance of Victoria's ranch, annotated in red ink and grid lines. Sit, she said, not looking up. Remember you asked me to look into her finances. What I found goes so far beyond embezzlement we're not even in the same universe. She slid the first photo across the table, an aerial shot of Victoria's ranch. What I'd always assumed were cattle barns were metal structures laid out in a tight, organized grid, connected by buried pipes and conduits. They're not barns, Sarah said. I hired a drone team, enhanced the images, count the cattle. I studied the photo, maybe 200 head and nowhere near the 2,000 the infrastructure suggested. Exactly, Sarah said, already pulling out the next batch of photos, 237, to be precise. So what's she doing with space designed for 10 times that? Then she dropped a photo that made my blood freeze. Men in hazmat suits, moving between buildings, handling containers marked with chemical hazard symbols I recognized from engineering coursework: ammonia, acetone, red phosphorus, synthetic drug production. Sarah said grimly, we're talking industrial scale. I stared at her, unable to speak. I'm not guessing, she said, sliding over a thick folder marked with federal seals. The D's been watching her for 18 months. They suspect her ranch is the largest synthetic drug facility in the U.S. Those barns are meth labs, fentanyl processors, and chemical storage sites. The cattle are just cover. She handed me a redacted D report. Even in blackout, the message was clear. They can't get inside, Sarah added. It's too secure, too remote. She's smart, but she's sloppy with money, and that's where you came in. I felt like the ground had tilted under me. The house demolition, the land offers, the water system. Oh my God, I whispered. I've been playing a game with people who kill for a living. She finished. She handed me one final document, a surveillance log detailing Victoria's connections to a distribution network spanning from Mexico to Canada, product valued at over $50 million a year. My property, the water system beneath Ida, wasn't just important, it was critical. Drug manufacturing needs huge amounts of clean water for cooling, for processing, for disposal. I wasn't standing in the way of a local zoning dispute. I was standing between a cartel-scale operation and its survival. And now, I had leverage. You've been controlling the lifeline of a federal crime syndicate. As if my morning hadn't delivered enough shocks, Sarah pulled out one last folder. There's something else, she said. The reason Victoria needed your house demolished wasn't just about blocking the view from the highway. Your property sits on the only high ground with a direct line of sight to the ranch's main processing facility. She unfolded a topographical map and pointed to the elevation markers. I hadn't paid attention to those before. Just lines on the map. Now they told a very different story. The D's been trying for months to position surveillance equipment there, she explained, but they couldn't legally do it without a warrant, and they didn't have enough justification. Victoria knew that. Your house was the only place with a clear shot. That's why it had to go. I stared at the map, at the photos, At the constellation of evidence spread across the diner table, I felt like I'd slipped into some parallel universe where property lines and HOA fines were the cover story for cartel activity. This wasn't a land dispute, it was the edge of a war zone. "What the hell do I do with this?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Sarah looked me dead in the eye, her tone unflinching. "That depends on how you feel about being the most important witness in what could be the largest drug bust in Texas history, because whether you meant to or not, Ezra, you're the only one with the legal authority and physical access to shut down their entire operation." She slid her phone across the table. On the screen was a contact card. "Agent Rebecca Martinez, AD, Dallas Field Office. The question now is," Sarah said, "are you ready to stop playing defense and go on offense?" I looked out the window. Victoria's ranch shimmered peacefully under the morning sun, still the picture of rural tranquility, but now I knew what it really was, a front for a sprawling criminal empire. I thought of my mother's grave, the house crushed under a backhoe to keep secrets buried, the neighbors who had no idea they were living next to a poison factory. I picked up the phone. "Make the call." Agent Rebecca Martinez arrived at my motel room that evening. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of dismantling empires built on fear and blood. Early 30s, dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail, and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Thornfield," she said as she laid out a series of surveillance photos on the table, "before we ask you to help us finish this, I want you to understand what you've walked into." The photos told the story better than words ever could. Armed guards, unmarked trucks arriving at night, people in hazmat suits unloading cargo, and then Victoria herself dressed not in her usual HOA pastels, but tactical gear, barking orders like a battlefield commander. "She's not just running a drug operation," Agent Martinez said. "She's the Southwest Regional Coordinator for a cartel network stretching from Mexico City to Montreal. This ranch isn't just a lobby, it's a fortress." I stared at the pictures, trying to reconcile the woman who used to bring casseroles to community potlucks with the one giving kill orders over encrypted radios. "How long have you known?" She pulled out a timeline that looked like a military dossier. "We first flagged the ranch 14 months ago after satellite thermal scans showed heat levels inconsistent with any known agricultural operation. But Victoria, we've been tracking her for 3 years, ever since her ex-husband died in what we now know was a cartel-ordered assassination, disguised as a car crash." It clicked then, the grief behind Victoria's eyes, the urgency, the rage. She hadn't always been this person. "She didn't start as a criminal," I muttered. "No," Agent Martinez agreed. "Her son died of cancer, the bills bankrupted them. Then her husband was killed for refusing to launder money through his construction firm. After that, a broken bar, she crossed the line, took over, used her HOA role as cover, and built an empire." She handed me a printed operation plan, tight, strategic, efficient. "Here's what we need from you. Tomorrow morning at exactly 10 a.m., you'll shut off the water completely. No flow to the ranch. Their chemical cooling systems will fail within 6 hours. That will force them to start moving equipment fast. That's when we move in." She pointed to spots on an aerial map. "We'll have teams here, here, and here. Your job is to stay in position, maintain the water cut off, and monitor everything from your vantage point. We'll outfit your family's valve chamber with a periscope and secure communication." There was just one problem. "If I shut off their water," I said, "Victoria will know exactly who did it. What's to stop her from sending those armed men after me?" Agent Martinez's expression didn't change. "Nothing," she said, "which is why you won't be here. You'll be underground, in that chamber, behind 6 feet of stone and guarded by 30 federal agents." At 9:45 a.m. the next morning, I stood in that chamber, dark, cramped, unchanged for generations. My hand rested on the cold brass wheel that had quietly controlled a drug empire's lifeline. Agent Martinez's voice came through my earpiece. "Teams in position, Mr. Thornfield." "On your mark." I thought of the graveyard, of my mother, of what Victoria had turned our town into, of all the lives her product had wrecked. "For you, Mom," I whispered, and I turned the valve. All the way, the results were immediate. By 11 o'clock, vehicles scrambled across the ranch. By noon, hazmat teams were loading equipment with frantic speed. Through the periscope, I watched Victoria, and no longer polished, no longer calm yelling into phones, directing traffic with clipped, desperate motions. At 2:15 p.m., she made the call that sealed her fate. 3 words: execute, execute, execute. Agent Martinez's voice crackled in my ear. That's the trigger. Move, move, move. What followed was a masterclass in federal coordination. Helicopters thundered overhead. Black-clad agents swept in from every angle. Breaching charges echoed across the valley. The ranch's walls crumbled in a storm of precision and power. And I stayed underground, in the stone vault built by my great-grandfather, holding the wheel that had quietly changed everything. Victoria Blackwood was arrested on the ground directly above where my family's home had once stood. Through the periscope, I watched her fall to her knees as Agent Martinez approached, badge in one hand, handcuffs in the other. Agent Martinez herself placed the cuffs on the woman who had destroyed my home to protect a criminal empire. Victoria looked older now and diminished, as if the weight of everything she'd built had finally collapsed on top of her. As she was led away, she glanced directly at the ground above my hiding place and mouthed a single word: "Why?" The answer was simple, though I doubted she'd ever understand it. Because some things are worth protecting, some fights are worth having, and sometimes, the person who seems powerless is the one holding all the power. Above me, the last fragments of her empire were being dismantled. The once bustling ranch had fallen into an eerie quiet, the hum of trucks, machines, and cartel logistics all gone. The silence was almost surreal. Then came Martinez's voice through my earpiece: "Mr. Thornfield, you can come up now. It's over." I emerged from the valve chamber into what looked like the aftermath of a small war. Federal agents were loading up evidence containers. Hazmat teams secured barrels of waste. Along the road, a convoy of vehicles stretched like a silent procession. Agent Martinez met me with the steady gaze of someone who had done this before, but not like this. "Ezra, you need to understand what you've helped us accomplish. This wasn't just some backwoods drug lab. Victoria's operation was feeding networks across 12 states. You helped stop nearly $200 million in narcotics from hitting the streets." The number was staggering, but what hit me harder was what those drugs would have done: families shattered, kids addicted, communities hollowed out. All of that stopped cold. She handed me a preliminary report that read like something from a movie script. 47 arrests, 15 buildings seized, $18 million in assets frozen. Enough synthetic chemicals to fuel the underground market for half a year. Just then, a black sedan pulled up the main drive. 2 lawyers stepped out. One of them, Victoriasa, had recently sent me a cease and desist letter. Martinez intercepted them before they got far. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw the change on his face. Smug, confused, pale. He just realized who his client really was. But the day wasn't done surprising me. 3 hours later, Agent Martinez approached again. "She wants to talk to you," she said, holding out a phone. "Victoria, she's in federal custody, of course, but she asked for one call, and she wants it to be with you." I stared at the phone, unsure if I wanted to throw it or answer it, but something in Martinez's voice made me pause. "Sometimes people need to understand how it all fell apart," she said. "Sometimes they need to apologize, or just say goodbye. It's your call." I took the phone and stepped away from the crowd. When I answered, her voice barely resembled the polished HOA president I had once known. It was smaller, worn down. "Ezra," she said, "I never meant for it to go this far. I was just trying to survive." "I'm not here to gloat," I said quietly. "I just want to understand." She told me things I hadn't expected: about her son's death, the medical debt, her husband's refusal to cooperate with the cartel, his murder disguised as a car crash, and then, about the quiet, desperate slide into criminality. "I became the kind of person they died trying not to become," she said through tears. She admitted that when she had my house torn down, she told herself it was about security, but deep down, she'd been jealous. Jealous of the life I still had, the things she'd lost. "Victoria," I said, watching the sun dip below the horizon, "what you built destroyed a lot, including yourself, but recognizing that a broken bar, maybe that means something's still left to rebuild." There was silence on the line. "I'm sorry, Ezra," she said at last. "About the house. About your mom. About dragging you into this. I know I can't undo any of it. 6 months later, I stood in front of a new house rebuilt on the exact same spot where the old one had stood. The entire community had shown up to help. P. Thompson personally oversaw the new kitchen, ensuring that the oven wouldn't ruin another pan of cornbread. Marcus Rivera helped launch the Thornfield Community Rights Foundation, funded by the federal reward money I'd received. Sarah Chen won a Pulitzer for her investigative series on rural drug networks. She also became one of my closest friends. Victoria, serving a 12-year sentence reduced to 6 for her cooperation, sent a letter from prison. Enclosed was a $50,000 check from her personal funds for the foundation, helping protect other people's homes. She wrote, "Might be the first step toward earning back some of what I lost." That evening, I walked to the old valve chamber for the last time. I turned the brass wheel slowly, hearing water rush through pipes laid down by my great-grandfather. Life, flowing out to the land. This time, I wasn't cutting anything off. I was simply honoring what my family had always done, providing, protecting. In that quiet chamber where justice had finally overtaken corruption, I could almost hear my mother's voice in the stillness. "You did good, son. You protected what mattered, and you did it the right way." I closed the chamber door and walked back toward the house, our home. The porch light glowed in the dusk, a warm beacon cutting through the dark. Because home isn't just a place, it's a promise, a vow that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. And the greatest battles, they're not always won with fists. Sometimes, they're won with wisdom, and a will to do what's right when no one else will. Ezra's story is a powerful reminder that even when everything feels lost, one person, in the right place at the right time, can change everything. Have you ever stood your ground to protect something that mattered? Share your story in the comments. You never know who you might inspire. And if this story moved you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that justice, though sometimes delayed, always finds a way. This is HOA Stories. Until next time, keep believing in the power of doing what's right.